So if you look at Georgia's ethical responsibilities of engineers in large organizations, the Pinto case, if you read the first paragraph, you get a general sense of what he's doing here. And that is, while recognizing that there is such a thing as engineering ethics, that engineers do have to have a professional ethics, engineers do have to have an ethical consciousness, that, in his opinion, this, among some people, has been taken too far. As he says, the zeal of some preachers, however, has gone too far, piling moral responsibility upon moral responsibility on the shoulders of the engineer. So what he's trying to do is to set a limit, or set a proper limit, the appropriate limit to ethical responsibility when it comes basically to the first canon, public safety, for engineers. So that's the general idea of this work. And if you go to the end, maybe it was a good thing just to read the things at the end, which he has, where he talks about where responsibility lies. I mean, he wants it to be a better world too, and he wants engineers to act more ethically, and he wants products to be safer, and he wants to prevent things like the Pinto as well. But we see that he also thinks that the best way to do that is not by making engineers more ethical, but by changing the conditions under which engineers work, which is basically a matter of changing corporations and of government involvement. So let's take a closer look at this. He starts out with a discussion of the Pinto case, a rather detailed discussion of the Pinto case, which is a very interesting case, especially because the Ford Corporation was actually criminally prosecuted for the Pinto, which is rare. It might have been the first time. And although that case, Ford was acquitted, he recognizes that really had to do with the details of the Pinto crashes that killed people that the case actually looked at, and you'll see why. But his general conclusion is that it's just really likely that Ford released a dangerous car. Ford released a car in the Pinto that was a hazard, and I think that there's just no getting around that. For instance, to put it in Kipnis's terms, that the release of the Pinto on the public lowered ambient levels of public safety, and it really had to do with the fact that it was less safe than other cars in its category. That its capacity to withstand a rear impact collision was noticeably worse. I mean, it was substantially worse than the other cars that it could reasonably be compared to. There's kind of no doubt about that it was a bad thing, that somebody goofed, somebody blundered in releasing this car. It should never have happened. And that, if we're to put it in moral terms, the introduction of the Pinto was an unethical act. As he says here, well into it, this is page 3, the issue of Ford's being guilty of acting recklessly can, I think, be made plausible. Yes, sure. The accident, whatever. Okay, yes, it was, yes. And the decision here, referred to several times in the essay, not to introduce, an engineer suggested that they could introduce this part that would I don't know if it would solve the problem, but it would certainly ameliorate the problem. And Ford's decision not to do it was a terrible decision. Right. Okay. So then we get to the heart of the essay here on page 4. Given these facts, what are we to say about the Ford engineers? That's where the real, important ethical reasoning starts in this essay. What do you say about the Ford engineers? Where were they when all this was going on? And of course, his answer is they were doing their jobs. Um, you know, they were designing a car, and they were making recommendations in terms of what that car should be like and could be like under the constraints. And they were making safety recommendations. We can assume that the Ford engineers were cognizant of the state of the art in producing the model they did. When tests were made in 1970 and 1971, and a memo was written stating that a $6.65 modification could make the gas tank safer, that was an engineering assessment. Whichever engineer proposed the modification and initiated the memo acted ethically in doing so, certainly did. The next step, the administrative decision not to make the modification, was, with hindsight, a poor one in almost every way, et cetera, et cetera. But then the key statement is that here on the next page, yet if we are to morally fault anyone for the decision not to add the part, we would censure not the Ford engineers, but the Ford executives, because it was not an engineering, but an executive decision. Well, that's the thrust of the thing. I mean, that is, and as he goes on to say, right here, below that, my reason for taking this view is that an engineer cannot be expected and cannot have the responsibility to second guess managerial decisions. That's perhaps the most contentious thing that he says in the entire essay. And in my experience of looking into engineering ethics, discussing it with students over many years, maybe that's the big dividing line in people's attitudes, is whether this is actually true. Is it the responsibility of employed engineers to second guess managerial decisions? If you think ahead to Templin, I think that the answer he would give is certainly yes. That's part of their professional duty, is to second guess managerial decisions. It comes with being a professional and knowing that you know more than your managers about public safety, about the technology's effects on the public, about risk. DeGeorge is saying that can't be the job of engineers. That is not their province. What is their province? He says the engineer is responsible for bringing the facts to the attention of those who need them to make decisions. Yeah, that's a reasonable position, but I think a lot of people would disagree that that's the limit. That is, that the responsibility of the engineers is just an informative one, bringing it to the attention of those who make the decisions. And it's for you to decide, me, but you can certainly see that we've heard other voices in this class that would disagree with DeGeorge on this point. But certainly he says there are situations in which, it brings up the question of when that I suppose becomes, after this long thing here, engineers in large firms have an ethical responsibility to do their jobs as best they can, to report their observations about safety and improvement of safety and management, but they do not have the obligation to insist that their perceptions or their standards be accepted. They're not paid to do that. They're not expected to do that. And they have no moral or ethical obligation to do that. That would put, I think, DeGeorge directly in opposition to Kipnis, who thinks that if you judge that the project you're working on is a menace, you simply have a responsibility not to work on that project, and you may have other responsibilities too. Whereas DeGeorge conceives of it or describes it in terms of safety standards. That engineers are good. That one of their jobs is not to set safety standards, but just to inform people about the technical things they need to know to do that. But then DeGeorge, he takes a turn in the essay, a rather strange turn, actually, in terms of, well, assuming that there are times when engineers need to do more than simply inform their managers of the technical side of things. He says at the top of page 6, in a rather strange turn, at the same time, engineers are required by the professional ethical codes to hold the safety of the public paramount. And then proceeds to give a set of criteria for when that can be done and when that must be done. You can read these for yourself, but this is, obviously quite an important part of the essay. It's really the reason the essay is remembered is because of these criteria for ethical whistleblowing. As I said in class, you simply have to understand the difference between moral permissibility and moral obligation. The first 3 criteria are the criteria that need to be met before whistleblowing on the part of an engineer becomes morally permissible, something the engineer can do ethically. The second 2, the 4th and 5th, are the further criteria which need to be met before that becomes obligatory. That is, of course, the first 3 would need to be met before it becomes morally obligatory, but it only becomes morally obligatory to blow the whistle if the 4th and the 5th ones are met. There's nothing that I need to say about those that would add to the clarity of them, but that's an important part of it. So yeah, that's the essay. I don't know what else to say, except what I said in the beginning is that that the thrust of the essay is to set certain parameters for the moral obligations of engineers when it comes to the first canon. And the last part of the essay is really about where he believes our attention should be. And that is basically creating a society in which the decision makers, who are not engineers, but public officials, the public itself, and a democracy, perhaps managers or executives at corporations, are committed to changing the situation so that products like the Pinto don't get released and engineers aren't put in very difficult positions where they're working on things that are as bad as the Pinto. So it really kind of shifts the whole thing really away from engineering ethics to a whole different emphasis.